Nintendo has announced two major limited editions of the Switch, one in the US themed around Mario's colors and a second in Japan themed around Monster Hunter. Due to the timing and price of such editions of the console, many have speculated that if Nintendo is planning a mid-generational upgrade to the Switch, it won't release anytime soon. Now, whether the reveal of these special editions holds any weight against a Switch 2, Super Switch, Switch Pro, or whatever Nintendo decides on naming the unit doesn't change the over 2 years worth of information that has been making the rounds regarding a new Nintendo console. And besides, Nintendo has released special editions of the DS and 3DS before their generational updates as well. You friggin' doofs. In 2019, Nintendo silently released a refresh to the Switch-based unit, likely as a response to the hardware-level exploit that allowed users to hack their consoles easily. This newer version of the Switch was known to have slightly faster loading times and significantly improved battery life. This was achieved, in part, due to the change in what's called an SoC, or System on a Chip, that runs the entirety of the Switch's software. Nintendo partnered with NVIDIA for the Switch, and the lineup uses a variation of a chip type called the Tegra X1, an ARM-based processor used in NVIDIA's own Shield line of devices. With the base model Switch vulnerable to exploit, Nintendo upgraded Switch units to the newer Tegra X1 Plus SoC, being entirely backwards compatible but with a lower power draw and higher overall compute efficiency in older software. Following the release of the X1 Plus units, then being codenamed Mariko, electronics vulnerability researcher Mike Heskin explained on Twitter how Nintendo is able to push the same software to a variety of different hardware configurations and see similar results across the board. Heskin claims that while at the time there was no known information related to a complete hardware refresh using entirely new processing units, there was evidence to suggest that Nintendo had already started supporting unreleased configurations of the Switch lineup, however. In an attempt to explain, I will try and simplify what Heskin said on Twitter. Effectively, within each release of the Nintendo Switch operating system, being the software that runs the console and allows for games to be played, there are profiles that allow the software to be run on different versions of the Nintendo Switch hardware. This is done so that things like the Switch Lite will remain compatible with everything the normal Switch can do. However, since Switch Software version 5, which was released on March 13, 2018, other unreleased versions of the Switch hardware have also been supported. Some of these units were hardware released exclusively to game developers. However, one in particular, codenamed Calcio, appeared to be entirely unknown at the time. This Calcio unit appeared to contain double the RAM, or memory, of previously released Switch units, and a smaller SoC process, meaning the used processor could be made smaller, allowing for lower power draw and possibly higher efficiency. We're going to return to that a little later. Now, a Korean message board named Klein went viral in Western circles due to a publication of a rumor related to a new Switch unit that was published in January of 2020. A rough translation of the post is as follows, quote, "This information is from China. The difference from previous rumors is that Nintendo will not adopt an additional clocked-up version of the Tegra X1 Plus. Nintendo's partner sources say that Nintendo has a custom processor that is currently being developed in collaboration with NVIDIA, but according to the information from Taiwan, it is not yet time to enter mass production," end quote. This hearsay asserts that Nintendo's next hardware will not be utilizing the Tegra X1 series of system-on-a-chips, or SoCs, and instead will include a new, custom processor developed in-house in collaboration with NVIDIA. While we cannot take this information beyond anything other than hearsay, we will return to this detail a little later. The Taiwan Economic Daily News published a story on August 23rd of 2020, headlined, quote, "New Switch Stocking Platform Chain Supplement," end quote. The article discusses the manufacturing process of the Nintendo Switch in China, and how that process has been affected in the previous 9+ months, both by a global pandemic and by the introduction of a new hardware configuration. A rough translation of the article reads, quote, "It will start stocking as soon as the 4th quarter of that year. It will come out early next year. It is reported that the new Switch is more interactive and has better picture quality and is expected to set off a hot sale again," end quote. The following day, Bloomberg News was able to corroborate the source and added with, quote, "Nintendo Corporation plans to debut an upgraded model of its Switch console next year along with a lineup of new games, though the specifications of the new machine have yet not been finalized," end quote. In October of 2020, 2020, the Chinese economic report UDN added to the supply chain story by suggesting that Nintendo was both investing and tooling with mini LED displays for the next Switch hardware. Again, a rough translation of the report. Quote, Nintendo has recently begun preparations for the production of the next generation Switch to be launched next year, planning to introduce the most popular mini LED display technology and come to Taiwan to find Innolux to supply it, breaking the previous Switch from Sharp and Japan Display Corporation, or JDI, two major Japanese manufacturers supplying displays. In the past, Switch panels were mainly supplied by two Japanese companies, being Sharp and the Japan Display Corporation, with IGZO technology panels. Innolux has entered the Switch game console supply chain with mini LED displays. This is the first time that a Taiwanese manufacturer has supplied Nintendo's key panel components, end quote. Switch units until now have utilized LCDs, being a cheaper display technology. Mini LEDs, however, do come with their advantages, including higher contrast range, lower power draw, and a mitigated halo effect seen when bright objects are seen on a dark background. In December of 2020, Polygon published an interview with Doug Bowser, president of Nintendo of America, and Polygon pushed on these claims, asking, quote, obviously rumors of a Switch Pro have basically been floating around for years at this point. You know, for a while it was alongside the Switch Lite, and then that didn't end up happening. These days, hardware strength is all the rage. Nintendo has never been one to push hardware, but obviously at this point a 720p handheld screen is getting a bit creakier. How does that match with Nintendo's long-held strategy of updating the hardware after, say, 3 or 4 years, end quote. Bowser responded with, quote, yeah, a couple of thoughts there. There were a few questions in there. Let me just break them down. First, we're always looking at technology. And as we know, technology is consistently evolving and changing. And we're always looking at what is coming to determine how we can enhance and improve the gameplay experience, and whether that's on a current platform or whether that's on a future platform. However, we also see right now, and we just talked about, that the momentum on Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch Lite in the 4th year is strong, and we believe we're changing the trajectory of another typical console life cycle. First, the hardware form factor obviously is something, but then the way we build games onto the platform and the way partners build games onto the platform is really what matters, and the experience that you will have when you play. So that's what we'll continue to lean into as we go into really what will be the 5th year of Nintendo Switch. And as Mr. Furukawa, president of Nintendo, mentioned in his corporate management policy briefing, we believe that it's just at the midpoint of this life cycle on this platform. Right now, with the momentum that we have, our focus will be on these existing form factors, end quote. Bowser is a corporate executive, and this is an expected non-answer. Unfortunately, there is very little to glean from this response, aside from the confirmation that yes, Nintendo is experimenting with new hardware all the time. However, a week following this interview's publication, it was reported that TSMC, the company responsible for actually manufacturing the SoCs for Nvidia that are used in the Nintendo Switch, would halt deal pricing for larger companies. This, at least according to a report from Tom's Hardware. Quote, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, or TSMC, has annulled volume discounts for its largest customers and raised prices amid overwhelming demands for its services, a media report claims. As demand for personal computers, game consoles, televisions, smartphones, and other advanced electronics rises, so does the demand of all kinds of chips. Leading-edge system-on-a-chips made using 5nm and 7nm processes technologies designed for PCs, consoles, and handhelds usually make headlines when people can't get their new graphics cards or processors. But each advanced SoC is accompanied by a power management IC, a chipset, and/or an I/O controller that are crucial for its operation and which are made using mature nodes. Side note, this is the exact 16nm node that the Tegra X1 Plus is actually fabricated on. Nintendo does not purchase their SoCs from this company. They have a contractual obligation with Nvidia, resulting in the Tegra X1s to be supplied at an expected cost. However, if the fabrication cost goes up for Nvidia, so too does the bulk chip cost that Nintendo is responsible, at least once their current contract with Nvidia expires. It can also be assumed that this report is a delayed information drop, meaning that the decision to end bulk pricing was likely signaled to the affected corporations well before the public was informed. Exactly how Nintendo will change their process is unknown. However, we can go back to the report from the Korean message board Klein, where it was stated that Nintendo was working with Nvidia to create a unique SoC for the next Switch unit. If Nintendo wanted to avoid the price hike altogether, they could fabricate a novel yet wholly compatible SoC with NVIDIA, and shop that part to other chip fabrications. That said, the newest available information doesn't line up with this theory. Going back to Heskin, upon the release of Switch OS version 11, a new Switch hardware profile was leaked, codenamed AULA. According to a series of tweets made by Heskin on January 9th, 2021, AULA supports a mini LED display tied to a new panel manufacturer. However, this system still runs on the same Tegra X1 Plus SoC with 4GB of RAM seen in the released Switch hardware. There are a few differences here. First, the RAM appears to be fabricated on a smaller process, allowing, again, for lower power draw and likely higher efficiency. Although the system is quoted to house the same Tegra X1 Plus SoC, the existence of a Realtek branded DisplayPort to HDMI converter chipset is called into question. To quote Heskin directly, quote, AULA will feature an improved display of some sort, and it bundles a DP to HDMI chip from Realtek. Communication with this chip is done by NV Services, a system module using both new ILCLTs for sending and getting panel messages via the DisplayPort auxiliary. End quote. So let's back up. I know that was complicated. NVIDIA sells their own line of products that utilize the Tegra X1 Plus SoC. The line is called Shield. In late 2019, the NVIDIA Shield TV was updated to include a feature called AI upscaling, which allowed the unit to process the image into an impressive 4K output. Now, at the time of writing, this feature still only supports video playback. However, the results are dramatic and highly praised. This feature, the AI upscaling using NVIDIA's own DLSS 2.0, appears to be packaged into both this refreshed SoC and the DP to HDMI chipset from Realtek. Nintendo could allow the system to process the image after rendering, upscaling it to a respectable 4K with very little overhead. Then you have the case of Nintendo underutilizing their hardware that they already have, and they have been doing this since day one. In the current Switch, in the Switch Lite, and in the Day 1 Switch, all of the units are underclocked and undervolted. It is possible to hack a Switch unit and install a program called sysclk. When activated, this program will run on top of any game and allow you to overclock your system. This overclock can be achieved because Nintendo is using nearly half of the available speed of the Tegra X1's CPU clocks and 75% of its GPU clocks. If Nintendo were to pair a DLSS-equipped HDMI output with a fully spec'd and utilized modern Tegra X1 Plus SoC or compatible chipset, they could easily achieve a believable 4K image. The Switch Pro, Super Switch, or whatever Nintendo ends up calling the unit would have its selling point with very little cost increase for Nintendo. It's fucking genius. Call it the Super Switch because I like that name. I don't have any naming information. I don't even think Nintendo knows what they're naming it. Stop reporting on stuff without checking your sources, gaming news websites, you bunch of doofs.